Well, okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tim Kellett. I'm from Paydata. We're a reward management consultancy, those who don't know us, and we centre on things like benchmarking and pay structure design. Thank you very much for joining us today and sparing the time out of your busy days for today's legal webinar, looking at COVID testing and vaccinations in the workplace. And this was a subject matter from our recent HR workshops across different sectors in January and February. Seems to be a sort of an issue and a challenge for a lot of employers. So just a little bit of housekeeping first of all. We've muted everyone for today's webinar. If you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section and we'll endeavour to answer them. We'll finish at 11 o'clock today, so any questions that we aren't able to cover today, we will try to email out afterwards and answer as many as we can. So. We'll send out a copy of the slides as always, and a recording of today's webinar. I'll make that available afterwards as well. Just some introductions now. I'm delighted that we've been able to secure the time and expertise of two experts, legal experts, Vivian Reeve, who's a principal associate at international law firm Gowling, and Alice Lockney, who's a senior associate. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I think it'll be a fascinating discussion, a fascinating webinar. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alice, who will take us through the minefield of testing your workforce. Alice.
Thank you very much, Tim. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. As Tim mentioned, I'm Alice Lockney. I'm a senior associate in the employment law team at Gowling WLG. And over the past year, I've been helping organisations across a whole range of sectors address the various workforce issues arising from the COVID pandemic. And as businesses look to the future and slowly start to think about reopening physical workplaces, more and more of the questions we're getting from clients are about workplace testing and vaccination. So Vivian and I thought this would be a really good point in time to pull together some of the key issues we've been looking at for clients. So I'll spend around 20 minutes or so talking through some of the key legal risks around COVID testing, and then I'll hand over to Vivian Reeve to talk about vaccines. Vivian works with care homes amongst other clients, so as you can imagine, this has already been a topic of particular importance. I would ask you to just bear in mind today that obviously there's a constantly evolving picture, and as the science develops and government policy, including around employer obligations, evolves to respond to that, this is how it is today, but it may be that in the future there's more information available or the evidence changes. And as Vivian and I will both talk about today, that in turn can impact the factors that go into your decision making on testing and vaccines, and it may change the balance. So turning to testing, I'm conscious that amongst this group, we're likely to have organisations at a whole range of stages, from those who are weighing up whether to introduce testing systems in the workplace at all, potentially taking up the government's current offer of free rapid results tests, through to those who already have a system in place and might want to check that what they're doing is legally compliant, or maybe pick up some tips for dealing with tricky issues that have come up so far. So bearing that in mind, I've tried to include something for everyone over the next 20 minutes. So I'm planning to cover, firstly, should you introduce testing at all, and what are the legal constraints around that? For those with testing systems already in place, this may still be relevant if you're thinking of expanding testing to cover different groups, or considering whether to make testing compulsory rather than just voluntary. Next, if you do introduce testing, how can you keep your legal risk to a minimum? And I'll share 5 key questions all employers should be thinking about here. And then finally, when the test results come in, can and should you inform co-workers? So firstly, should you introduce testing at all? There's been plenty of publicity around the limitations of COVID testing, particularly the rapid result lateral flow test that many employers are considering using. private testing schemes can also be expensive, and if you get lots of employees testing positive, you may have issues with gaps in the workforce as people have to self-isolate. But there are some big names who've invested significant sums in building their own testing facilities, and more who are either partnering with the government's asymptomatic testing schemes or procuring their own private tests. So why are those employers doing it? I've put some of the most common reasons on the slide. It will often come down to the desire to protect employees' health and safety, but it won't be the same for every organisation or even every part of the workforce. It sounds obvious, but it's really important to stand back and give this some proper thought before introducing or expanding any testing programme, not least because that will be core to the analysis of many of the legal risks that we'll discuss today. So my first recommendation of the day is to really scrutinise any proposal to introduce testing. What will it actually achieve, given the nature of your workforce, the other protective measures you have in place, and how accurate the tests are that you're looking to use? So, moving on to some of the potential legal constraints on testing. We'll focus on data protection first, and then move on to look at unfair dismissal and discrimination as we consider mandatory testing. It's key to have data protection in mind from the outset, as this is the one legal constraint that could stop you from doing testing at all, even on a voluntary basis. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, as it's something you'll all have to navigate if you're looking at this. So, information about whether or not an individual has COVID-19 is health data. So it's unlawful to process it unless, 1, you have a lawful basis, 2, you meet an extra condition in recognition of the fact it's particularly sensitive, and 3, you have the right documents in place. If you don't comply with these requirements, the Information Commissioner's Office, or ICO, can take enforcement action, including issuing fines. So taking the lawful basis first, the 3 lawful bases that are most likely to apply are there on the slide, along with their GDPR references in case you're going to need to do some risk analysis around this. The ICO has stated that for most employers, the relevant basis for processing testing information will be legitimate interests, although for some public sector bodies carrying out their public functions, they can rely on their own specific condition. It's also possible that processing could be justified on the basis of compliance with a legal obligation, if you're carrying out testing in order to meet your legal obligations towards employees' health and safety, for example. Interestingly, though, the ICO hasn't referred to this in their online guidance, but that guidance is subject to updates, and the ICO has said that organisations need to make their own assessments based on their individual circumstances, and I do think that for a lot of employers that will actually be the most appropriate one, rather than legitimate interests. But given the emphasis on legitimate interests in the ICO guidance, let's just have a little look at what that actually requires. So if you're relying on legitimate interests, you need to go through a 3-step process. The type of analysis required will be familiar to many of you as HR professionals who've had to consider the justification defence for potential indirect discrimination claims. The stages are, firstly, what is the legitimate interest? And this is where your assessment of why you're actually doing COVID testing is key. Secondly, is processing the data, so carrying out the test or looking at the results, necessary to achieve it? And thirdly, is processing justified when balanced against the intrusion on the individual's rights and freedoms? Assuming you have a lawful basis for processing, the next step is to identify which of the special category conditions applies. Again, the ICO has helpfully published guidance on the 2 conditions it considers are the most likely to apply. Firstly, the employment condition, which will apply to most employers who are carrying out testing to protect the health and safety of their staff, but is unlikely to apply where testing is introduced more in order to provide customer or employee reassurance rather than protecting their safety as such. And then secondly, the public health condition, which might apply in the case of an employer who's looking to support efforts to stem the spread of the virus in general by testing and reporting results to public health authorities, potentially again through this government asymptomatic scheme. So let's distill all of that into a couple of case studies. In the case of employees working in a busy manufacturing environment, the nature of the work might mean they can't work from home, and there will inevitably be some close contact between employees despite social distancing measures. In that case, the employer is likely to have a lawful basis for carrying out regular testing to identify asymptomatic cases, either on the basis of a legal obligation, so discharging their duty to protect the health and safety of staff by reducing workplace transmission, or on the basis that testing is necessary for the legitimate interests of guarding employees' health and safety, and there's no less privacy intrusive way to do so because the other COVID secure measures don't go far enough given the nature of the workplace. Similarly, testing is likely to be in compliance with the organisation's employer health and safety obligations, therefore meeting the employment special category condition. The intrusion on the individual's privacy can be minimised by limiting access to test results to those who need to know and storing the results for no longer than is necessary. In contrast, in a professional services environment, an employer might want to introduce day one testing as a way to persuade employees to come back to the office where they've been working remotely through lockdown. Besides the likely employee relations backlash and employment law issues with requiring people to come into work when they can work from home, I think at the moment it would be very difficult to justify testing on this basis under data protection law. It's hard to say that a one-off test would discharge an employer's health and safety duties, and it's unlikely to be legitimate to use testing in these circumstances when the far less privacy intrusive approach is to allow employees to continue working from home if the office isn't COVID secure. I think we're quite a long way off seeing the balance tip here, but it's potentially one to come back to as we hopefully continue to see cases decrease and vaccine uptake to increase. And then finally, in order to comply with your data protection obligations, you'll need to provide employees with a privacy notice, which could be a standalone notice provided before the test, or your existing employee privacy notice could be updated. And it's also recommended to use the ICO's template impact assessment and legitimate interest assessment too, both of which will help you show your reasoning in the event of a challenge. So that's testing in general. But if you're considering using mandatory testing, there are additional considerations to take into account. I would flag that mandatory testing is relatively unusual, and even for those working in clinical roles in the NHS, for example, testing is voluntary unless you have symptoms. If you do want to make testing mandatory, you'll need to consider, firstly, discrimination. Are there any groups that would be adversely impacted by the requirement to undergo testing? Disability is the one that immediately springs to mind, taking into account those with physical disabilities that could make taking the sample more difficult or painful, and those with mental conditions for whom this could, for example, cause heightened anxiety. Those individuals will be entitled to reasonable adjustments to the testing policy, and a blanket policy with no flexibility at all is highly unlikely to be justified as a proportionate measure, given the potential alternative safety measures available and the limitations of testing, as I've mentioned. And then don't forget unfair dismissal rights for employees with more than 2 years service. In some circumstances, it might be reasonable to instruct employees to submit to a COVID test, perhaps if employees are dealing with vulnerable people as part of their role, for example. But to go as far as implementing a disciplinary sanction or dismissal for a refusal to do so should only be taken in the most extreme circumstances. And I say that in general, it will carry a high risk of successful unfair dismissal claims due to the number of reasons people might be reluctant to undertake tests and the range of other measures that employers can and should be taking to protect the health and safety of staff and members of the public in any event. For both of these risks, the key is going to be to listen carefully to employees who express concerns or refuse to undertake tests so that you can make a balanced decision. It's likely to be much more effective to concentrate on engaging with employees and unions and getting them on board with voluntary testing. In terms of how you do that, in some circumstances, consultation will be compulsory prior to introducing a testing programme. For example, if this is covered by a recognition agreement you have in place with the trade union. But in any case, the government guidance on employer-run testing programmes is that it's strongly advised to consult before introducing COVID testing, and I'd echo that, not least because it will help you to get staff on board and spot any potential logistical issues early on. The TUC position on workplace testing is that it's a valuable tool in protecting workers' safety, but during consultation and when advising their members, unions are likely to be particularly interested in some of the issues we're about to come on to, including pay, time off, and ensuring testing isn't used to dilute the other COVID-secure measures that employers should have in place. So that leads us nicely on to how to successfully implement a testing programme. There are 5 key questions all organisations should be thinking about when designing their policy. And we'll go through each of those in turn now. So firstly, who will do the testing? Who will be taking the examples and analysing and processing the results? Will this be outsourced in full to a third-party provider, or will any element of it be carried out by your own staff or on the employees themselves? If staff are taking their own samples or reading their own results, there are a couple of specific considerations to have in mind. Firstly, results may be less accurate, so that needs to factor into your risk assessment and balancing exercise. Does this undermine your reason for doing testing at all? And secondly, staff with certain disabilities might find it more difficult to take their own samples and require an adjusted process or extra support. Thirdly, perhaps cynically, do you trust employees to provide you with accurate results, or do you want to build in a review by an objective person? This might be appropriate if, for example, you have a history of people coming into work when they should be self-isolating, and that will also tie into the topic of pay, which we'll come on to shortly. So that's who does the testing. Next, what type of test are you going to use? The key considerations to take into account are cost. So the government programme was expanded in February to cover most employers who are open during lockdown and have more than 50 employees. And under this programme, you can get free lateral flow tests until currently the end of March, and it's not yet been confirmed whether free support will continue beyond that date, as far as I know. But besides that, buying tests can be expensive, particularly if you're going to be using them on a frequent basis. So this will necessarily factor into what type of tests you're going to use. Secondly, speed of results. So if you want to use the results on point of entry to the workplace, it's not going to be helpful to have to wait 12 or 24 hours for lab results to be returned. Thirdly, the number of false positives or specificity. A high number of false positives will lead to more employees unnecessarily self-isolating. And then finally, number of false negatives or sensitivity. A high number of false negatives could lead to less asymptomatic cases being captured and potentially a greater spread of COVID in the workplace. And that could require more frequent testing in order to be effective at catching cases at an early stage. The effectiveness of your test for your particular purpose is a key factor in whether collecting test results is justified at all. So you need to do your research into this and ensure you can justify the decision. For example, if your stated reason is the protection of health and safety of staff, but you're planning to do a one-off test with a low sensitivity rate, will that really add anything over and above your other COVID secure measures? The evidence on effectiveness is constantly evolving, as are the options in terms of cost and speed, so this should be an ongoing analysis. So that's who, what, now where will testing take place? With the rise of self-administered rapid results tests, more employers are doing tests on-site rather than sending employees off to specific testing sites. Have you thought about how you would manage the practical aspects of this, like social distancing amongst staff waiting for a test, and how you would address any accessibility issues with the site to avoid placing disabled workers at a disadvantage? And finally, when will testing take place? And will employees be paid for that time? If it's going to take place outside of work hours, for example, if employees are going to have to turn up for a shift an hour early, have you thought about the impact on employees with childcare responsibilities or who would otherwise find it difficult to amend their hours? Is there a less discriminatory way of doing this? And can you really back up a decision not to do it in work hours? Both the time taken in having a test and travelling to any external site are likely to amount to working time for the purposes of national minimum wage and working time regs. So employees who are on or close to the national minimum wage must be paid for their testing and waiting time. And this also needs to be factored into daily and weekly rest calculations to avoid inadvertently breaching the working time regs. For those on a higher hourly rate or an annual salary who aren't in national minimum wage territory, there's no obligation to pay for testing time unless your contract says so, but refusing to do so is likely to make it much more difficult to get employees on board with voluntary testing. And finally, how frequently will testing be carried out? It's a bit like a DBS check in that it's out of date as soon as you've taken the test, and there's not yet a clinically defined number of times that an individual should be tested within any given time frame. Some high-risk workplaces are doing daily testing, but it's more common to see testing done 2 or 3 times a week, and that's the model used in the government asymptomatic testing scheme. There's some principles on the slide there taken from the government guidance on frequency of testing. I would just take that third one with a pinch of salt. It says you should take into account the risk profile of those in the workplace, for example, older people or people with underlying health conditions. But obviously the evidence on high-risk groups is constantly evolving, and it's not just those 2 groups that are now thought to be at higher risk. So just to wrap up, what should actually happen when the test results come in? So whilst waiting for a test result, there's no obligation on the employee to self-isolate unless they have symptoms. If the test comes back negative, you'll need to ensure you clearly communicate to the employee what that means. It's still possible they could have COVID, so they should immediately self-isolate and book an NHS test if they get symptoms. And in the meantime, they need to continue following all of your COVID-secure protocols. You also need to make sure the results aren't shared any more widely than necessary, are only used for your stated purpose, and that you only hold on to them for as long as is necessary for that purpose to avoid unpicking all of the good work you've done on data protection. That might just be until the next time the employee has a COVID test. If you're doing regular testing, there may be no need to hold on to them for longer than that. What if the test comes back positive? Well, the employee must immediately start self-isolating and should be entitled to statutory sick pay and contractual sick pay, subject to the usual eligibility requirements and what your contract says. Until January, there was a requirement to book a confirmatory PCR test with NHS Test and Trace to confirm a positive result, but this has been temporarily suspended according to the Test and Trace website, given the volume of lateral flow tests being carried out. Some employers, though, will still do a private confirmatory lab-based test to confirm a positive result to get around that risk of false positives and people unnecessarily self-isolating. If you choose to do that, the employee must continue to self-isolate until the result of the PCR is back. But if it does come back negative, they can stop self-isolating at that point. In terms of telling colleagues, you should inform those who've been in close contact with the employee that a colleague has had a positive test, but you normally won't need to and shouldn't disclose who it was that's tested positive. And finally, I've just put a couple of key resources on the slide there that I think are compulsory reading for anyone looking at introducing workplace testing. These will be included as links in the slides that Tim will send round after the presentation. But with that, I will hand over to my colleague Vivian to talk about vaccines, and I'll be back at the end to pick up any questions on testing.
Thanks very much then, Alice. That's really, really helpful, fascinating. And over to you, Vivian.
Thanks, Alice. I'm just trying to change the slides down so you can see my slides. Okay, so we're going to talk about vaccines now for about the next 20 minutes. What I'm going to cover is why businesses are asking staff to have the vaccine, the employment context and the legal considerations, and how to manage the risk and encourage staff to have the vaccine. So I think most people would agree that the development and rollout of the COVID vaccine has been quite incredible. The NHS are working through the priority groups 1 to 9 at a pace. And the news figures, which have been imprinted on my mind in terms of daily cases, hospital deaths, are coming down quite well. I think that's down to lockdown and vaccine and obviously all the other social distancing and PPE measures too. And as more people have the vaccine, more data is collected, and data is starting to show that the vaccine not only protects very well the individual who is having the vaccine, but also reduces transmissibility. So it's reported in The Guardian last week, you might have seen that a single dose of the Pfizer vaccine can reduce asymptomatic infections by 75%, which I think is remarkable. So that's people who don't have any symptoms, and they're the kind of the most difficult group really, because they're, going around as, well, not as normal because life is not normal, but we don't know you've got the symptoms, you don't know you're passing it on. So as we're frequently told by the government scientists, we do have to keep up the PPE and the social distancing for some time yet, because the vaccine is not a panacea, and that double edge is really relevant to our session now. So you'll have no doubt seen over recent weeks that some employers have started a no jab, no job policy, which creates quite the soundbite. So we're going to have a look at whether that's legal and whether it's a good idea. You'll know that the government has not made the vaccine mandatory and is instead relying on very rapid rollout and high take-up, relying on persuasion, education and goodwill or peer pressure, depending on how you want to see it. There are a number of reasons, as I'm sure you know, as to why businesses are looking to mandate the vaccine. The first is to protect staff individually and also now with transmissibility. The second is to protect clientele, so customers, residents or service users. And thirdly, to try and get back to some sort of normal business, because there are certain areas of the country and certain industries such as hospitality and travel which have been decimated by the necessary lockdowns. But as you will be aware, mandating a vaccine brings all sorts of risks. So we're going to look at the employment risks at the moment. The key message I want to get across throughout the next sort of 15 minutes is that context is absolutely critical here. So we're going to look at a couple of differences between care providers such as Barchester and Care UK, which are said to have been rolling out a no jab, no job policy, and also Pimlico plumbers who are doing the same. So just as a reminder, I think the first thing to say is that we've got the employer's duty to protect and report. So the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 requires employers to protect, so far as is reasonable, the health, safety and welfare of staff and others such as visitors, residents, clients who may be affected by the business. And secondly, COVID is a reportable disease under the Reporting of Injuries, Diseases, Dangerous Occurrences regulations, much better known as REDOR for obvious reasons. So these are the first two good reasons to encourage staff to be vaccinated. So, as I said just now, context is key. So what I mean by that is a three-stage process. We're talking about what industry you're in, what business you're in, and then the role of the individuals that we're thinking about. So the first question really is about which staff or job applicants face or pose the highest risk of contracting or passing on COVID. So Barchester and Care UK are two care providers said to be requiring all staff to be vaccinated. They are focusing understandably on the vulnerability of residents and staff to improve safety. And it's a bit of a no-brainer. You can see they're at the front line. The government has prioritised care homes. We've got elderly and disabled residents, care workers and nursing staff who are in very close contact with very vulnerable people and may be vulnerable themselves. We also have the issue of agency staff who may be coming in and out as well. So there could be a reasonable turnover of staff depending on sickness, absence and all the rest of it. So clearly this is a high risk environment. If we were to contrast this to Pimlico plumbers, for example, or any other maintenance service, let's say, is there the same level of risk? Possibly not, because although a maintenance worker, a boiler, repairer, a plumber, an electrician is in and out of a premises, possibly people's homes, they're not coming into such close contact because they could be in a different room in the premises, whether it's a commercial premises or a personal home. They can have windows and doors open, and they're not kind of face-to-face feeding and dealing with that very close contact with people. So immediately you can see that a different context means a different risk, and that different risk needs to factor into our assessment of whether we should and whether we can try and make people have the vaccine. So the vaccine is, as I've said, only part of the health and safety process. We've been living with risk assessments and PPE and social distancing for some time. So the key I wanted to get across here is it may be necessary to take a different approach for different roles and different types of staff group, depending on what they're doing. So I think it's useful next to think about, when we're thinking about can we require people, is why people may not want to have a vaccine. Vaccine hesitancy, as it's known, is a really complicated scientific and psychological area, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to be able to summarise it in the next 15 minutes because I can't. But I wanted to kind of distinguish between two different sort of types of reasons that people might be reluctant or hesitant to have the vaccine. So there are some people who will be medically advised not to have it. From my understanding and reading and preparing for this and more broadly over the last couple of months, that's actually quite a small group of people. There are also some people who might have allergy concerns, but having, I have to say I'm very fortunate, I had my vaccine last week, and speaking to the healthcare professionals then, I asked about allergies and they said actually nearly all people can have them, and if you have an allergy or you've been concerned about vaccine allergies before, most of the time obviously you should check with your GP or medical professional, but most of the time you're still advised to have the vaccine. It's just that you might be advised to have it in a more clinical setting. But even in the GP surgery I went to, they had people ready to deal with anaphylactic shock, for example. I think one of the main issues that we're all trying to grapple with is misinformation or fake news, which has been a serious issue, particularly ironically in the healthcare environment, where you might expect that medical advice and guidance would take precedence. And I think there's been quite a lot of stories in the media, and I certainly know medical professionals who've been quite concerned and baffled that medically trained colleagues of theirs are more likely or have been taking more notice of honestly what Sandra has said on Facebook or somebody said on Twitter rather than the government advice. And I think, you know, I don't mean to be flippant, but I think it's a really important point, you know, whether it's COVID or elections or whatever, election fraud, whatever it is, we are living in an age where there's a lot more misinformation, and that's in any public health issue. This is something we've got to try and deal with. So there's the medical issues and there's potentially misinformation issues, and there may also be objective reasons potentially covered by the Equality Act, which I'll focus on in a minute, which might also feed into people's reluctance to have it. The key is to find out and then inform, because that will inform your approach. So in terms of encouraging staff to have it and finding out and how you deal with the whole process, your businesses will likely be at a different point along this path, depending on what business you're in and what sector you're in. So some will be considering asking staff to have the vaccine, or asking just new starters, as I know some of my clients are doing at the moment. Some have asked everybody to have it, or certain groups of staff, and have different rates of uptake. I think particularly in the care sector, the concern is that there is still a significant proportion of care workers who are still vaccine hesitant or refusing to have the vaccine. I think for those who need to press ahead, because perhaps you're in healthcare, and get as many staff vaccinated as possible, you may already know how many people have not signed up or have actively refused to have the vaccine, because you've sent out a questionnaire, you've asked people to sign up, and you've directed them through to how they can sign up to have the vaccine at various care centres. Or it might be that actually you're not quite sure how many you're dealing with. I think it's important, I'll talk in a minute about how we can get a handle on the numbers, and I think the key in terms of the whole piece as you would with any HR or change process, is about consultation. So the first is asking people, once you've identified broadly or specifically groups or individuals, asking them to explain their hesitancy, actively listen, share information, share medically sanctioned information. There's a lot of useful information that can be shared directly. I think sharing, putting people in touch with others or colleagues or people that have already had it seems to help in some situations because it gives people confidence to have it. There are various group supports as well in terms of, it's a two process thing. I think there's the individual and the group. I think you've got unions, as far as I can see, unions have generally been very supportive of helping to encourage people to get the vaccine. A lot of employers will have staff council and representatives. The NHS also have a really good unit called the NHS COVID Behaviour Change Unit, which helps promote the persuasive case for vaccination if you're struggling to persuade people. And of course, as ACAS and the CIPD as well have also produced some really helpful information. I think once we've started the conversation and you have a gauge as to how many people or which groups are reluctant, we're then moving on to think about what are the risks if we feel that we do need to take that step and try and make it mandatory. There are a number of risks depending on whether we're talking about existing staff or new starters. New starters are easier, so we're going to focus on existing staff to start with. The first point I've put there is about discrimination, because indirect discrimination is the most likely complaint or claim in the worst case scenario that we might see. And that's because if we are asking or going further to try and require staff to have a vaccine, this will be a policy. So you're not just applying it to one person, you're applying it to a group of people, some of whom may consider that they are put at a substantial disadvantage by that policy compared to other people who don't share their characteristic. So what I've put on the slide then is 4 areas or 4 protected characteristics under the Equality Act that have been discussed and that we think are the most relevant at the moment. So older people are being prioritised. So it's easy to see that if you are a younger person, you've got younger staff, then if you're requiring them to have a vaccine, unless you are in the healthcare sector or a sector whereby there's an easy route to have a vaccine, regardless of your age, as there is in healthcare, if you're not frontline staff in particular, you can see that there may be an issue there because younger people are not going to be able to get the vaccine as easily. Disability is another relevant consideration. It might be that some people are advised not to have it. It may be that because of a physical or mental or both impairment type situation, one or other or both might make it difficult for them to process the information, to deal with the change, or indeed to have the vaccine in the form that it's in. Again, I think from what I have read, the number of people who can't have it are relatively small, but this is an important consideration in terms of having it and also communicating. Pregnancy is another area. Although the guidance at the moment is that it's not known to be unsafe to have it if you are pregnant, because the vaccine is very new, the data isn't there yet. So more evidence is needed, as I understand it, before it is a firm advice that pregnant women have the vaccine. But I think we need to bear in mind whether it's mandated or not, actually pregnancy is a specific medical bodily process that affects women differently, depending on their own situations. And there may be women who are either pregnant or trying to conceive who don't want to have it, and they don't want to disclose that because, we all know, despite best practice, and I'm sure all of you would follow that, there are a lot of issues with pregnant women and women on maternity leave being discriminated against, and actually they don't need to tell you if that's their reason. So that's a tricky one, because it might be that you're faced with somebody who doesn't want to tell you why. The last one, I think, and very interesting, is religion and belief. Now, I think all recognised main faith leaders have come out publicly to say that they support people of their faith having the vaccine, which is a really good starting position. There are no animal products in it, which would be an issue for some religions. I think the more likely challenge is not from a kind of mainstream religion, but from a philosophical belief point of view. So, for example, somebody who says they are an anti-vaxxer, who has a belief in not having vaccines, or potentially Jehovah's Witnesses or Seventh-day Adventists. I think I've seen some commentary around those religions too. And for that, if we have a challenge on that basis, then we need to be going back to what's called the Granger Test. And this is a specific test for philosophical belief cases. So we would need to be looking at whether it's genuinely held, whether it's a cogent, so does it make logical sense? Is it a serious belief, and is it worthy of respect in a democratic society? So again, I don't want to be flippant, but there's been a lot of misinformation about whether there are going to be bugs in the vaccine, whether Bill Gates is going to be able to see what everybody's doing, whether there's a high link into China, all that kind of thing. You can see how that's really not going to come up to muster with the Granger test. It's not cogent, it's not serious, arguably. But there may be some people who are closer to being able to show that they do have that belief. So whatever the protected characteristic, the point then is with indirect discrimination, and the key for an employer is, can we justify asking or requiring staff anyway? So this is a two-stage test. We've got, firstly, can we show a legitimate aim? And secondly, is it proportionate? Which Alice has touched on already. So the legitimate aim in this context, in this global pandemic, and particularly in this country with the very high number of cases and deaths and hospitalizations that we've seen, I think legitimate aim is pretty easy, because, for example, we might say that we are trying to ensure, so far as possible, the health and safety of our staff, residents, visitors, etc. So I think that one's probably not too problematic. The issue is it proportionate? And that means weighing up the impact on the business and the impact on the individual. Now, it's tricky here because the impact on the individual is severe. It's an invasive medical procedure that we're asking them to have, and potentially, although as Alice said, we'd hope it'd be very much last resort, disciplinary action or dismissal even in very specific circumstances, if they don't have it. So it's a very weighty issue on the individual basis. And here again, context is critical. And with Alice, it matters which industry you're in. Is it healthcare, for example? What is the role and what is the individual? So if we're talking about a care worker, a cleaner in a care setting, a health worker, you can see that it would be easier if we can't show that the existing PPE and social distancing measures are not enough, and that they're not because government are trying to get everybody to have it, then you can see how it would be easier, not easy, but easier to try and justify that than if you were in an office setting or you're having people working from home, for example. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to carry on. Oh, my slide's not moving. Hang on, there we go. So the other, that was discrimination. The other risk of trying to impose it on staff is potentially constructive dismissal. So as you know, there's at the root of your employment contract, your relationship with staff is that duty of implied trust and confidence. So we have to avoid doing anything that breaches that bond. It's very unlikely that any of us have got a contractual right to enforce a vaccine, because this has never been an issue before. Is requiring somebody to have the vaccine a reasonable management instruction? Possibly. Context is everything. It depends on the sector, and particularly you might be getting there with health workers, but as Alice said, with the testing issues, we're not quite there yet, I don't think. From a staff perspective, you know, your staff have a duty to try and protect themselves and their colleagues to the best of their ability as well. It's possible that if you try and require somebody to have the vaccine, they might, if we're not able to resolve it amicably, they might resign and claim constructive dismissal. I think it's probably unlikely at the moment, particularly given the current job market, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a serious issue that we've got to try and manage. And obviously we don't want to get to that position with staff. We want to be able to work, you know, productively, and that's not the word, we want to act with best practice and treat them with respect. We don't want to get to that point, but it's possible. On the flip side, if you do have staff that refuse, and you do, for whatever reason, particularly in high risk industries and roles, feel that you do need staff to have it and they refuse, what do you do? So can we accommodate? Can we have anybody working for, so I've got to think them off my screen. Can we try and move them to a different part of the workplace? Could they work from home? I think anyone who can work from home probably is at the moment. So that's why, you know, frontline staff, that's critical, because we can't really have them working from home in most cases. So what do we do? Worst case scenario, we might consider whether we could suspend on a short-term basis with a review, and in the meantime continue that conversation about trying to persuade, or waiting until we've got more data from the government and medical entities about you know, the protection for individuals and transmissibility. As Alice said, disciplinary action is possible, but it's a last case scenario, a sort of last resort scenario, but it could be justifiable if the context is right. And I'm going to talk about healthcare again, as you know, getting bored of hearing this. The last 2 points I just wanted to make, because we're nearly at time now. We've talked about asking staff if they've had it. I just wanted to reiterate, much like Alice was talking about with the data protection angle, we need to just think about, we need to just think about what, why we are asking people to have it. Why do we need to know if they've had it? You don't really need to know if you've got people working from home or even spaced out, so they're not really coming into contact, whether they've had it or not. What does it matter? What are you going to do with that information? If you've got people on the front line, there's much more reason to, you know, you do need to know whether they've had it. What will you do with the information? The government have not mandated vaccines or records of vaccine or having asked people. There's no clear guidance that you can rely on to justify collating it. So your reasons, you've got to be clear about your reasons for asking, who you're asking and why you need it, what you're going to do with it. So in a GDPR data protection context, it's thinking about who's going to collect the data, who will it be shared with, and how long will it be kept for? And then the last thing I just wanted to flag, I'm just going to move my slide on, is whether we can treat new joiners and staff differently. We are seeing people, particularly in the care sector, do that, and I think it's justifiable in some situations, because for a couple of reasons. So we need to be careful, because if we're asking job applicants whether they've had it and whether they will have it, or asking them to have it, that is a pre-employment health questions situation, which is covered under the Equality Act and data protection. So we need to be careful about who we're asking why and what we're going to do with it. Discrimination risk that we talked about just now does apply to new joiners and applicants as well. You don't have to be a current member of staff, as you know, but there is less risk for new staff and joiners because you don't already have a contract employment. So you could make a contract conditional on having the vaccine or having it within a certain number of weeks or months. And you also, if you're a new joiner, you don't have unfair dismissal rights. So you can make it a condition of employment. You don't have that issue about trying to agree it by consent. So I hope that's been helpful. Happy to answer any questions. What's the takeaway? The takeaway is context, if I haven't rammed that home enough, is really important. Communication, and just bearing in mind, I think there's one thing I meant to say actually, just considering how you communicate with people who might have a disability, who might be neurodiverse, who might need extra time to understand the consequences and consider how they respond to a request. So back to Tim, thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Vivian and Alice. As I said, it's really, really interesting, and hope a lot of people have taken some takeaways from this. We've still got a bit of time left just to answer some questions which have come up. We've got a few, and as I said, if we'll try and answer as many as we can, and if we can't, then we'll certainly type some answers up and send those out afterwards anyway. So so we've got a question here for on the testing. So this will be for you, Alice. What are the options if an employee refuses to have a test, and can you put them on unpaid leave?
So I think this is something that will has been and will be coming up for almost every employer that introduces testing. You're going to get people who aren't that keen for whatever reason to take a test. My advice so far to clients, and it remains the case, is firstly, you need to treat them as an individual. Ask what the reason is that they don't want the test, because lots of employees, in my experience, actually welcome the testing as something they recognise is there to protect them. And it may be that this individual, it's more a concern around the logistics of physically being able to get to a testing site or within the testing hours, or it might be a concern about pay. So whether they're not being paid for that hour, or whether they wouldn't be able to afford to live on statutory sick pay if they're required to self-isolate. So it may be that you can address some of those issues and the individual would then be happy to have a test. If it's not about that and it's just about, for some reason, they actually object to having a test at all, I think you then need to go back to your risk assessment of what was it about this role that made you decide testing was appropriate in the first place. So are there some tweaks you could make to the role? Could they temporarily work from home? Could they do something different that's maybe not quite so frontline or high risk or high contact with other employees? Because it might be that you need, the vast majority of your workforce there in person, but you could make an exception for this individual if it's appropriate. And I think it's only after you've gone through all of that and you still decide, yes, we do need this specific person to undergo regular testing, that you're then in the territory of, is it so important that we'd consider unpaid leave or some disciplinary sanction? And as I said in the talk, and as Vivian's echoed in the vaccination stuff, that is just that because of the nature of it, going to inherently be high risk. So you'd need to take that decision quite carefully.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks, Alice. And actually, there was another connected question from someone else who's saying, so if testing is completely optional in a return to the office setting, does this ease things from a data privacy perspective?
That's a good question. So I think it would ease things from an employee relations perspective. So you're obviously not going to have the scenario we've just talked about where someone's refusing, because you're not going to make anyone do it who doesn't want to. In terms of data protection, though, ultimately, if you're going to touch the test results in any way, so if you're going to know whether somebody tested positive or negative, you are processing that data under the GDPR, and consent isn't a valid basis for processing the vast majority of data in an employment context. So just because someone said, I'm happy to show you my test result, you still need to meet one of the other conditions that we've talked about. Ultimately, it's going to make it a smoother ride, I think, if people are only getting tested and sharing results if they want to, but you still need to do that underlying analysis of why would we want to know at all?
Yes, I see. Okay, I'm just going to, just for sort of easing things a little bit, I'm going to, or spreading things out, I've got some questions on vaccines as well. We've got lots of questions actually, but on vaccines. And so Vivian, could you let me let me know your thoughts on vaccine passports by any chance?
Sure. I think, sorry. Vaccine passports are really interesting. So I think the concept is largely that once you've had a vaccine, you have as I was given last week, you have a little card to say what you had and when you had it. And that might be made into something more formal, so that you can then have a pass, as it were, to go to events or to do certain things in society. The government at the moment is not introducing them, but they've sort of done that thing a bit like that, whether the vaccines are mandatory, they've said, we're not going to do this, but you might think about it if you'd like, which then puts obviously the risk assessment onto businesses. I think certain industries, I can see why, so hospitality, travel, I can see why there's more appetite to do that there. And I know some businesses are already into creating those passports and working out that infrastructure themselves. I think there's a risk. The question is, how big is the risk? The risk is around discrimination against people who can't or won't have had it yet. So age, pregnancy, disability, religion and belief. and also the timing of when they have it. There's a data protection issue about processing, as Alice has explained, about the fact this is sensitive data. I think passports, I think the important thing for me, that we don't know enough about it yet, but the important thing I think is, if you're considering a passport, is to have a different, to mitigate those risks, is to have a second option. So for example, if you want to be able to offer a vaccine passport to open up hospitality events or sports events, it could be you show a vaccine passport, or you have an instant flow test, and then you wait, and if you put, if you're then negative, you can go through. So that would be a way of mitigating the risk. I think it's a really interesting concept, and I think probably there is going to be more support for it going forwards, but those risks that we talked about in terms of vaccines still apply to the passport situation. So it's a little bit kind of wait and see what's happening, but yeah.
Sort of suck it and see. Yeah. There was another question which sort of partly you've answered with that. There's sort of a follow-up one, which was basically, what if someone doesn't want to tell you, or tell us as the employer, or give us any information about whether they've had a vaccine?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it depends. I hate saying that. I'll rephrase that. The context matters again. So if you've got, let's say we're in healthcare or something frontline, where there's a higher need and a lower risk of asking people to have the vaccine. If somebody says they won't tell you, I think the first thing is you have to respect that position, and we see what we can do to work around it first. So can we have, is there any way we can work around it? Can we move them to a different role or to a different part of the business? Can they do anything remotely at all? I don't think we should be trying to pressure people. We can ask them to say, it's a little bit like reasonable adjustments and disability, in that you don't have to say, but if you do, it's helpful. So if you can build that trust with somebody and say, respect your decision that you don't want to say, but we have to carry out a risk assessment, and with regards to your situation and your work and interaction with other people. So it would really help us if you could give us a bit more information. It might be that you might ask a trusted colleague to be involved in the conversation, or a trade union or staff council or something like that, to have a facilitated conversation if it's really critical person. Or it might be that you say, okay, leave it there. I'd like you to think about it. I'm going to send you some information. Would you have a think about it? Can we catch up in a few days? Have that conversation again. So like a consultation, like you would another contractual change, really. And then see where you get to. If you have somebody that absolutely refuses, and they absolutely refuse to give you the reason, then I think we need to think about how we can otherwise mitigate risks. So it's the risk assessment with regards to them, but also their colleagues, and whether it's residents, customers, whoever, and do our best to try and mitigate it that way. Because the vaccine isn't mandatory at the moment, but we have to do all we can do to try and consult and be collaborative. And if we're in a high risk industry, in a high risk role, and perhaps we have other people raising concerns, then that's when we'll probably get to a crunch point. And it may be in limited situations that disciplinary or perhaps some unpaid leave, as Alice has suggested, might be an option. But I think you need to kind of not slowly, but go through those steps to try and consult and discuss, and then see where you get to, if that's helpful.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much, Vivian. I'm conscious about time, and so I'm going to. We've got lots of questions, so we'll endeavour to answer them after today's webinar. That's it for the time being. Just a quick advert. I hope you don't mind. We've got another legal webinar from Vivian and Alice's colleague Anna, looking at yet another key outcome subject matter from our HR groups, and this is looking at the new ways of working going forward once restrictions are started to lift more. It's going to be supported by a short online survey as well, so around people's views and experiences as well. So if you want to register for that and you've not done so already, please do so. So that's that. Just like really one final thing to say, thank you so much, Vivian and Alice, for your expertise and your time today. I found it really fascinating. It's obviously a moving feast as well, so I found that really helpful. Thank you everyone else for joining us as well today and spending the time. I hope you found this useful. And we'll hopefully see you at the next one. So in the meantime, have a good day, have a good rest of the week, and catch up again soon. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.